During the pandemic, we're doing quick little 5-10 minute conversations, whether it be on FaceTime or sending pictures back and forth of the cleaning room, of your pictures of your cabinets. I went through pictures the other day looking for something for my personal life, and I tell you, I've got more pictures of cleaning rooms and cabinets than I do of my own family.
Rising above the buzz of ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week, we speak with frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs with a common goal to help you fight dirty. Every instrument, every time. Whether you are tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you did. Now, turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go beyond clean.
On this Vendor Spotlight, we speak with George Cronin, National Sales Manager for TRICOR Systems. George has been working in the medical device field with a specialty in flexible endoscopes for over 20 years. He has held roles in sales, marketing, education, management, and commercialization for both Pentax and EndoChoice before joining TRICOR Systems. At TRICOR, he has led the commercialization of Dri-Scope Aid and the development of their family of products. He is an active member of SG&A, AMI, and ISHM. And we have a good one for you today. We're going to be speaking with George about the TRICOR Systems Dri-Scope family of products. And when we say family of products, that means there's multiple options, and the Dri-Scope team and George will be able to consult with you and talk about what your existing infrastructure looks like, what your budget is like, and help you make the most cost-effective improvement to your processes, especially in light of the new multi-society guidelines that recently came out recommending a 10-minute dry time. So we're going to get right into it, and we'll be right back with George Cronin after a short break.
You're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
Joining us now is George Cronin, National Sales Manager at TRICOR Systems. And George, I've been really looking forward to this one. The topic that we're going to be discussing today is a really important one, and one that has really started to gain a lot of traction, I think. More attention than ever before. And it might even be due to the multi-society guidelines and that conversation that's ever present. So we're going to be talking about flexible endoscope drying as we go through this conversation. So I wanted to welcome you and thank you for coming on today.
Thanks a lot. I'm really excited to be on this today. I've been following Beyond Clean since you guys started up, and just to be part of it and see this progression, not only just with where I'm going with my product, but where you guys have come and where the industry is going.
Excellent. And even before we get started, you're from TRICOR Systems. Maybe you could give us some background on the company.
Yeah, absolutely. So TRICOR is a family-run company that started back in 1976. We're based out of the Chicago area, and we're a contract manufacturer. So we're servicing multiple industries, anywhere from military to aerospace to medical, and it's a company full of engineers. So we're synonymous with quality, and it's really engineering to that excellence. And within the medical side of it, a lot of our medical products are coming from that healthcare professional. And what we're trying to do is provide you that total package from the concept that you have all the way through commercialization.
You know, one of the things I love, and I hear this a lot lately, especially in healthcare, but you talked about multiple different industries. And so anytime you have experience in different industries like that, it really gives a well-rounded perspective. And I know even in supply chain, a lot of the people that I talk to, many hospitals are looking for new employees or recruiting talent from other industries just to incorporate those different perspectives. So that's really strong. And I think there was another thing that you just said, which is really key, the fact that you have all that technical expertise, but your innovation is really driven by the end user. So clinicians are involved in that process. And I think that's so important because you can have the best innovation in the world, But if the end user doesn't like it, then it never gets used. And so it just seems like there's a lot of purpose in the way that you go to market with your products. Is that true?
Yeah, that's true. And if you think about it with engineers, and any engineer listening to it will nod their head that they'll just keep engineering. And they'll just keep on working on it until somebody tells them to stop. And you need that end user, the people that are sticking their heads out the door saying, hey, can you fix this problem for me? And then having those engineers combined with those end users to finalize a product.
Yeah, it's so funny. I've seen that happen where, you're trying to get to that critical mass with a product. So you keep doing and keep doing and keep innovating. But then all of a sudden, when you start to get the feedback, then you just try to keep up with optimizing based on the requests that you get. And that's when you know you've done something right. So talking about doing something right, every one of these innovations that comes out and helps drive our industry forward, they're all coming from a place where they're trying to solve some sort of a problem. Like they see a need, or maybe it's that end user, that clinician has a need, and you try to solve that problem. And so with our conversation today, what was it that TRICOR saw out in the industry that they felt was like, this is a major need that we need to help fix?
Yeah, that's a great question. What we've seen in the past 10, 15 years, we've made lots of changes in the cleaning endoscopes process. And as we've kind of grown along the way in those 9, 10 steps that are in that process, one area that was perceived done is drying endoscopes. So what we thought was happening was the alcohol flush that was coming at the end of the reprocessing cycle, and then gravity, because we take those scopes and hang them up, that would take care of our drying process. Even though we've had studies all the way back to 1991 that showed bioburden would grow in scopes if you weren't drying the scopes for a minimum of 10 minutes mechanically. So everyone understands now that need to dry the channels. We talk about the new studies that are coming out. There's multiple studies showing that proliferation of bioburden growing within those endoscopes. And really what we kind of came to market with was how we're going to do it. Everybody knows why we need to do that now, but how are we going to do it and automate that process? And that perceived value that we had of, hey, this is going to be taken care of, that's no longer there. As everybody remembers when they've got their scope cabinet and they go and they hang up their scope, and down the bottom, everybody had chucks pads. And those chucks pads were stained and wet, and we'd take them and throw them out when they were gross or at the end of the day, and then lay down a new one. Not a very pretty sight.
Were they high-level disinfected or were they sterile? No, obviously they were dirty, right? And so that was evidence.
Yeah, and that's the evidence that they're not completely dried, right? That was the evidence that we saw right in front of us. But in a lot of our heads, we're hoping that that's the gravity. Everything's gone out into the bottom of the cabinet, so it's got to be taken care of. But we know it wasn't. And so the main goal was, how do we do this and automate that process, that critical step? Because we're also doing a lot more today than we were in the past. We're trying to do more in the same space with less time and with the same amount of instruments to turn that over. So how do we automate that and take out that human variability that is that critical step that we seem to miss sometimes?
So, George, it seems like I've had so many conversations about that exact piece, is how do we help reduce the human error portion of this? And remember, prior to the pandemic, the conversation was squarely on, these flexible endoscopes. It was probably the number one topic in our industry. And yes, we've had to pivot over the last 12 months, but that doesn't mean that the issues have gone away. And it's kind of unsettling sometimes when we blindly follow a process, even though when common sense tells us there's more to the story, like with the chucks pads there. And so you're talking about removing the potential for human error or variability. And so what is it about the Dri-Scope family of products that really solves that problem and differentiates you from some of the competition out there?
Yeah, so coming to market with the original product, it was there to automate the drying the internal channels, but that wasn't the end goal. The end goal was to dry the internal channels for every facility in every lab, and not force you to say, now you have to automate your drying, this is the product that you have to buy. It's let's find the product that works right for you. We have our small little Jetstream product that can dry up to 2 scopes at once before you bring them to storage. We can retrofit cabinets, or you can buy new cabinets that can fit into your existing space. And what we're going to do is we come in and we help you identify which product works best for your facility. So one product isn't better than the other. It really comes down to what works best for your flow, and not just the flow of your lab. It's time, it's your space, it's your budget, and all of those things factor in. And then what we want to do is come in there and have that conversation with you to figure out which product is going to work best.
So it really sounds consultative to me. You have a lot of different options, and there are many considerations. I've seen some pretty interesting setups for some of these clinics too. And I mean, even the ones inside the hospital, especially older hospitals, like their access to ventilation and everything that goes into just setting up the department properly. It isn't always very easy to do. It really isn't. And so it sounds like you have a lot of different options, but I guess the question I would ask you is, how do you figure out which one's the right one? Like, how does that consultative process work?
Yeah, so in pre-pandemic, you would reach out to us, or our sales rep would come in, that you probably know a lot of the sales reps that are out there, and they'd come in and do a walkthrough with you, and then we'd do a product demo. During the pandemic, we're doing quick little 5-10 minute conversations, whether it be on FaceTime or sending pictures back and forth of the cleaning room, of your pictures of your cabinets. I went through pictures the other day looking for something for my personal life, and I tell you, I've got more pictures of cleaning rooms and cabinets than I do of my own family.
I love the innovative use of FaceTime, but it's true. You're just trying to collect information to help a customer make a good decision and the best decision. And so with things being so different and not always being able to access physically that space and look, just using that technology, do you find that that's just as effective? I would imagine you can get all the same information over FaceTime as you did when you were going to every single one of these in person.
Yeah, you really can. You can get most of the information done. And then when it comes down to, okay, hey, we budgeted for this, we're really ready to go, then it takes that site visit. And again, that site visit is short, just to do that final walkthrough and to really see the flow. And again, it goes back to when we talk about engineering new products and having the healthcare professional with us, we want to be in front of the techs that say, this is the steps that we take along the way, and this is where the scope ends up, and then we can truly identify the final version of what we're going to come to you with.
So it sounds like you really take ownership and lead this process, which you mentioned something that's a challenge for every single facility, which is just time and resources. And so simply just trying to buy something and put it in and not necessarily know if it fits, or coordinating that process on their own. I got to think that a lot of times for customers, that's just, I'm not ready to do that right now. Things are crazy right now. I've got so much on my plate. It sounds like you're taking a lot of that off of their plate. And that's really what that consultative process is about, is you take ownership over the project so that they can make the process improvement that they really know that they want and that they need for patient safety.
Yeah, what we're trying to do is take that from that product introduction all the way through leadership justification. And so we'll build all that. This is what we do every day. So I've got all your studies and all the paperwork, and we can help you walk through this. Again, it comes down to you don't have any time. You're trying to do more procedures and ramp those procedures, especially now trying to ramp those procedures back up that we have such a backlog on, that you don't have time to do all this research. And even in some of your prior podcasts, I've heard of some of these professionals like tiptoeing around that they have an educator because they feel bad that they have an educator and their other peers that they work with don't have educators and they don't have those people to do the research. So we can do that research for you. Maybe, hopefully you'll buy my product, but if not, you'll at least be pointed in the right direction.
Yeah, that's awesome. Let's talk about some of the additional product and features. I mean, I can see where just your ability to work with the customer is such a differentiator, and the justifications, because that's sometimes it, like you might be working with somebody who's leading the department who knows that this is exactly what they need, but then how do they make that case to senior leadership? And you just described that you have all of the scientific research that backs that up, and that you have a lot of different ways to fit into different budgets and based on physical constraints and budgetary constraints. That's awesome. So what are some additional products and features, maybe some benefits that you want to make sure we highlight about the Dri-Scope family?
Yeah, so a few of them in there is that our dry time is 10 minutes. And we look at different products that are out there in the market. Some are longer, some are shorter. And again, it goes into that fitting into that infrastructure is one of our key highlights, that we're not going to make you do any construction, that we can fit into that space. And the reason we can do the 10-minute dry time is because we're focused on flow rate. So the great first question I usually get from a nurse manager is, what's your PSI? I've got to make sure that I'm not going to damage my scopes if the PSI is too high. And any product out there, any drying product on the market is way below. Nothing's going to damage your scope that's coming to you commercially. Where we get fearful is when we use that air gun that's attached to the wall and putting that onto a channel of an endoscope, those channels are glued on. And so too much pressure can actually blow one of those channels off and damage your endoscope. And that's where that big concern is. But we focused ours, again, with the engineering, rather than focusing on what pump is going to give us the greatest PSI, it's which pump out there is going to give us the greatest flow rate.
So let's sit on that a little bit, because I definitely understand the PSI. It's just pressure. So higher pressure, maybe some people are thinking higher pressure, that's better because we're able to dry the scope faster because we're putting more volume of air through. But you just told me it's a 10-minute dry time, straight up 10-minute dry time. And so I'm wondering what this flow rate and how that relates to the dry time relative to pressure, because that sounds to me they're two different concepts. So what exactly is flow rate, and why is the highest flow rate so important?
To your point, pressure is pressure. A good way to think about this is watering your lawn. You have fixed pressure coming out of the spigot. And if you attach a hose to that, you could walk around a lawn and take care of it. It's going to take you a long time with just that water coming out. So what you do is you attach a sprinkler to it. Now, if you have a 1 acre lawn, that's going to take you a long time to water every part of that lawn with one sprinkler. So what we do is we split that sprinkler and add additional hoses to it and additional sprinklers to it. Now, if you think about sprinklers spread out across your whole lawn, if you have that fixed pressure coming out, that water is going to be trickling out of your sprinkler heads. So what we're doing when we're looking at flow rate is we're now taking those and splitting them up into zones. So the first zone goes and it's going to water that small area of the lawn. Then it moves to the next area and the next area from there. And that will take care of that entire lawn in certain zones and cover that area with the right amount of flow to water it properly. Now, if you want to go to the extreme when we talk about intense pressure, if you really want to water your lawn fast, you'd hook up to the fire hydrant down the end of the road. Now, of course, you'd blow your kids down the street and you'd ruin every flower bed. So you can't do that. So you have to look at what's that fixed pressure and then how do we push that out across the entire lawn to water it to have that proper flow rate in those individual spots.
So higher pressure for a shorter period of time, it's almost like any water that's remaining in those channels just gets out of the way and lets the air through. But in this flow rate, you're really promoting evaporation in those channels by, instead of having the water get out of the way, you're just bringing air through over a longer period of time so that the water evaporates, becomes part of the air, and joins it in exiting the scope instead of trying to get out of the way, I guess, is kind of how I'm reading that concept.
Yeah, exactly. So when we're using, let's say, go back to an air gun down in sterile processing, we put that on a scope, we'll get a bolus of fluid to come out. And everybody looks at it and they press down on it. If they don't have a regulator, every SPD professional that I've met, they know not to press all the way down if they don't have a regulator. So they press down on it somewhat. And then they get that big bolus of air
So what does somewhat mean? You just said somewhat. Is that measurable? Is that objective?
Well, that's, a joke we always make is that doesn't quite fit into the policy and procedures that I push down on the air gun a little bit and I do it for a little while doesn't necessarily flow long-term into your policies and procedures.
So your flow rates are set, and not only the rate itself, but then the amount of time, which means that the drying of the scope really does have an objective, measurable process that you've tested over and over. Is that correct?
That's correct. And we're doing all the channels at the exact same time compared to just doing one.
You talked about PSI and you mentioned the air gun. And I know a lot of times it's like, are you able to take those big tanks from outside of the hospital and weave a way for that compressed air to get all the way into the department? And sometimes infrastructurally, that's a challenge. It's not a straight path, especially through some older hospitals. Do you utilize the same air? How do your cabinets work that way?
Yeah, so we have actually, along with the multiple products, we have multiple ways to do it. If you had that air source already piped in there, great, we can hook up to it if you want to. But what we're doing is we're pulling in that room air into our pump, and then it's going through a 0.3 or 0.1 micron HEPA filter before it goes into your scopes. And that's how that can fit into the existing infrastructure. So if you picture your cabinet and if it's got a roll-up door on it, our pump just sits up in the top left-hand corner. If you're looking at retrofitting an existing cabinet or buying a new cabinet, they're going to come with HEPA fans. So they're cycling air around the outsides of the scope as we're pulling in 0.3 micron HEPA filtered air, and then that same filtered air is getting pulled into our pump, and then that's being cycled through again.
I remember one time I went in, again, older hospital, and I went to the GI lab and they had the cabinets there. And right where you're saying where the pump goes, they actually had it set up and it had a fan and then there was no filter. And then right above it, the air came in from the outside with a little bit of a fan on it and it was covered in dust. And I remember thinking to myself, man, that's got to be contaminating the scope. And so you're talking about essentially treating the air at the point of entry to the cabinet, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, that makes so much sense to me, especially when you're working with a department that does not have an ideal renovation or setup. I can just see how important that is. All right, so let's talk about, I mentioned the multi-society guidelines, and with them recently being updated, that's something we should talk about a little bit further. But what about other white papers or success stories that you have?
Yeah, so with the guidelines, they talk about automating that process and to dry all channels simultaneously for at least 10 minutes. Prior to that, we did a study with Stanford University. And what they looked at, and it was published in Gastrointestinal Endoscopy, and they were the first ones. There was lots of people, as we talked about earlier, that said, this is why you have to dry. Your scopes are dirty. If there's bacteria, if it's wet and dark in those scopes, and bacteria likes wet and dark, so you should dry them, you should dry them. What the group at Stanford is, they compared their manual drying, which was using a contraption that they hooked up with an air gun that was into the biopsy channel, and they ran that for 10 minutes. They compared that to our automated system. And it showed after 10 minutes with an air gun down just the biopsy channel, there was still fluid left in those channels for over 48 hours. Compared to after 10 minutes of automated drying, there was no fluid left immediately after.
So what's kind of coming down the pike with all of these guidelines? Because it really does. We talked about pre-pandemic, so much emphasis on this. Obviously, the work continued, even if maybe we didn't see as much in the media and as much emphasis on it. What do you think is coming down the pike? What's next after these multi-society guidelines? Yeah,
so with the multi-society guidelines, that's bringing in your AORN, your SG&A, your physician and GI governing bodies. And the next one that we're rumblings, and it's getting fairly close from what we hear, is that AAMI ST91 is going to be updating their guidelines. And from what I'm hearing from people that are on that committee is that they're looking at doing something similar, of automating drying for a minimum of 10 minutes, using a HEPA filtered air that's hooked up to all channels at once.
Yeah, so treated air, standardized process, and using a sufficient amount of time to dry. I hear that. Now, we talked about your consultative approach. And so as we're kind of talking about white papers and et cetera, I'm going to read a testimonial from one of your customers. In 2019, we were evaluating a few scope drying cabinet manufacturers. We reached out to George and his team to get another competitive quote on 5 cabinets we needed to purchase. We wanted to see what type of construction would be involved with his option compared to the others. They came in and in about 15 minutes told us that they could retrofit 4 of the 5 cabinets we already had and pointed us in the direction of one of their partner cabinet distributors so we didn't have to do any construction. This saved us a lot of money. We then introduced them to our SPD team since they were looking at a cabinet as well, and they ended up purchasing 2 of the small units since they didn't have the space. We have been very happy, and our infection control team has brought this across our entire IDN, so we all standardized to one system, and this is a customer in Atlanta, Georgia. So that's really, again, that consultative piece is really a testimonial, but also, George, I want to commend you. You help them save money, and budgets right now are tight, and hospital revenues have been significantly impacted, but there's still the Accountable Care Act. And if patients come back in with infections, it's just a double whammy on the finances. So you want to make sure that your scopes are dry, and for all those infection control reasons. And so at the same time, you found a way to do this. I just think that's great, because I think sometimes people just come in and try to sell them, hey, you need 5 cabinets, here's 5 cabinets, here's the quote, bang. In this case, it sounds like you really were trying to do the right thing for the customer.
Yeah, we are. And if I only had that one solution, we would be going in there and saying, here's my solution. But having those multiple ways to do it, it just opens it up to let the customer decide what's going to work best for them rather than us trying to dictate one solution for them.
Yeah, it's great when you have options. That's so key. And especially when somebody is going to give you one source, can give you multiple different options versus you having to work through and have multiple points of contact. I can see where having all those options also makes the process much more efficient. So how can our listeners engage if they are looking for some cabinets or looking for a solution or looking to upgrade their processes, especially as it relates to the new multi-society guidelines? How can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, so very simple. They could go to our website, which is Dri-Scope.com. They can find us on Instagram and Facebook. They can reach out directly to me. My email is george@Dri-Scope.com, and that's DRIScope.com. And then we can just set up some time to talk over the phone, and then we just go over what your process is and your flow is. We have a couple of pictures if the cabinet seems a way to go, and then we can take it from there.
So you can do a pretty basic initial evaluation, and then if you need to get on FaceTime, take the next steps.
Exactly.
Oh, that's great. All right, George, fantastic interview. Appreciate your approach to the market and solving the problems, and the fact that you've got all these engineers behind you that just continue to work to bring great solutions to our listeners and to the sterile processing and GI industries.
Thank you very much. It's been great being on Beyond Clean.
That was George Cronin, National Sales Manager at TRICOR Systems. And this was such an interesting conversation and very timely with the new multi-society guidelines coming out and recommending 10-minute dry times. I think one of the things that I really love about George's approach, and even as we talked to prepare for the interview, he was telling me about being able to hop on FaceTime to be able to continue to consult with prospective customers on solutions for their departments. And I love the consultative approach. I really liked hearing from the customer that talked about that consultative approach, and that it wasn't just focused on getting the biggest sale, but making the right sale and helping save money, especially in a time when budgets are extremely tight for all hospitals and health systems. Just as the background, talking about engineering and how that technical expertise, and George put it so well, engineers, they always have really good ideas, and the system can always be improved. And so they can just keep going and keep going but the way that the company engages the end user so that innovation is driven by clinicians is really critical. And I never really understood this PSI versus flow rate conversation, but I can definitely see where that's going to result in a more effective drying process versus a little bit of pressure for a little bit of time, having standardization and a standard process that's been tested, that's repeatable, and that gets you objective results. So if you're interested in learning more, you can contact George by emailing him at george@Dri-Scope.com. That's DRISCOPE.com. You can visit their website, Dri-Scope.com, and you can also follow them on Instagram. And that's going to do it for this week's Vendor Spotlight. As a reminder, you can help support Beyond Clean by subscribing on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and Spotify, or by downloading our smartphone application for iPhone and Android. We'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to the show. And if you have any topics that you'd like us to cover on a future episode, just send an email to info@beyondclean.net. Thank you for listening to this week's Vendor Spotlight on Beyond Clean.